All right, everybody. Hope you can hear me all right. This is John Gay. I'm the executive director of the John Quincy Adams Society. We've been doing these weekly sessions on various professional development topics because professional development within the foreign policy space is one half of the society's work, and that work doesn't stop just because everybody's stuck at home due to the virus. The other half of our work is intellectual development. Our session next week is going to be in that latter vein. We will be chatting with Ben Dennison of Tufts University on regime change, which is a hot topic these days. Just yesterday, the State Department released some new material articulating its vision for a new government of Venezuela. The maximum pressure campaign is still going on against Iran. There is increasing friction in Iraq between the United States and Iranian aligned forces. So there's a real prospect of increasing conflict, which might eventually include regime change as a goal. Scholars like Ben have done a lot of work to examine exactly what it is that regime change tends to do to states that are targeted with regime change. What happens? Does it actually improve outcomes for the state that's doing the changing? That meeting is going to be next Wednesday, the 8th of April. Note that it is at 6 p.m., not 7. We moved it back a bit as Passover is a little bit after 7 on the East Coast, and we wanted everybody to be able to participate. I've just posted the registration link in the chat. This afternoon session is going to be zeroing in on our professional development side. On how to improve your resume. And I always like, since I'm a strategy guy, JQA is a very strategy focused organization, to zoom out and begin with the end in mind. What is the outcome that you want from your resume? What exactly, to be precise, are you trying to accomplish with a resume? And I would say, if you had to put it in a sentence, you want to tell your story as a worker in a way that will make your future employer want to hire you. The second half of that sentence is very, very important throughout this entire process. You're trying to solve their problem. They need a person for the role. So your task is not necessarily to provide the most comprehensive or exhaustive summary or the most evenly focused summary of your work experience. You're trying to produce the one that is most relevant to that exact opportunity and to what you think that hiring manager needs. Another dimension that resumes that's important to think about in the resume sphere is that they are often fodder for an interview. I've interviewed a lot of people for jobs, and I can tell you, without fail, not only have I gone through the resume beforehand, of course, I've often marked it up and made little notes on it about here are things I want to dig into in the context of the interview. I'll have it sitting right in front of me. That's hardly unusual, especially if you're in a group interview setting where some of the people that are interviewing you might not know you very well. And so they have a very shallow impression of you, which is going to largely come from your resume and your cover letter. And that kind of ties into something that's also important to keep in mind, which, sometimes, especially once you're more well networked within a career space, in our case, the foreign policy space, you might get an opportunity where somebody comes to you and says, hey, we've got this great opportunity. You're the top person we'd like to consider. We think you're really going to get the job, but just send in your resume as a formality. You still want to get it really right there, just because other departments like HR or senior leadership in that organization may also have sign off on the hiring decision. They might not know you as well. They might be doing initial screens on candidates. I can tell you I've seen all of that happen, and I've seen problems arise for people within that process. So it's really important to get everything right on your resume and to have those ultimate goals in mind of really catering to that decision maker. I'm not going to cover right now the very basics of how to get started with a resume or some of the more technical resume-like documents, like say an academic curriculum vitae. I'm also not an expert on federal resumes, which are kind of their own thing. Although one of the sample resumes we'll look at later has some federal resume-like characteristics that are worth understanding. What I do want to talk about is some ways to improve or refine what you already have. So I'll start off with some basic formatting and submission tips. Then I'm going to talk about how to create a master resume that can serve as a backbone of your job search across a range of opportunities. How you can tailor your resume to those opportunities and tailor it to pair up well with your cover letter so that together they're telling a really strong story about you. And then in the process of preparing that, you'll need to look at your past experiences through a lot of different angles that can help you present yourself in the most compelling way. And so I'll talk about some of those different lenses that you can use. And then I wanted to go to two things in brief that a lot of people on their sign-up forms had indicated they wanted to hear about. The first one is resumes for people who don't have a lot of experience in the professional space, whether it's like your first job, an early internship, something along those lines. And second, resumes tailored to the think tank space, which I'm really excited about because I used to work in the think tank space. I'm still plugged in with the think tank space. So it's an area that I know a bit better, especially when you're talking about the roles that are most peculiar to the think tank space, research and analysis roles. And then I'm going to wrap up by going through a few of your resumes at the end to illustrate some of these principles that folks have sent in. And throughout any of this, if you have a question, you're going to click on the participant list. It's down at the bottom of your screen. Go to your own name and click the raise hand button. That's for those of you watching this on Zoom. We should have a Facebook live stream going right now as well. So if you're on the Facebook live stream, sorry, we can't interact, but I might check in on the comments later and wait for any questions. But just to kick this off, and I don't see any hands up yet, to kick this off, let's talk about some basic points for when you're submitting your resume. This is really simple, but a lot of people get it wrong. The file name of the resume that you send in, it's going to be, it has to have your name in it. I will often get resumes that just say resume, which is relevant for you. But again, you're trying to put yourself in the experience of the hiring manager, and they are getting lots of documents that are resumes. Ideally, I would say your name, resume. You might even list the name of the opportunity, program assistant at CSIS, and then maybe even a date, March 2020. And then anyone who's looking at that file is going to know what exactly it is that they're dealing with, because these things can get passed around, forwarded through chains of emails to different people. So you really want to make sure that it's easy to find and then re-find your resume. Another question that people will ask a lot is whether you should send in a PDF or a Word document of your resume. In my opinion, and I've seen other folks argue this online who are, hiring professionals who do that full time, that if you're sending it to an actual individual person, like if you're emailing someone your resume, you want to use a PDF. The reason for that is that Word documents can look bad. I can tell you when you open it up, I don't want to see formatting marks, a comment that got left over from when you had your friend look at the resume. I'll have spell check on, so I might see your typos highlighted for me, which is also not ideal. And I can tell you when we started out at JQA, when we were really small, we didn't have Microsoft Word yet, so we had an open office software, an open source software that was not quite as good as Word. And so you would get errors when you pull that document into your software. And so you can have all these weird formatting issues and readability issues. So a PDF is not going to have that problem. Again, that's for a specific person. If you're going into a portal where you upload your resume, it's a really smooth process. This is like a highly developed resume portal. What you might be dealing with is called an ATS, an applicant tracking system. And in some of these, a computer is going to be taking the first scan at a resume and grabbing that data, putting it into a consistent format across resumes. And it then is going to try to pull out prime candidates so that they can look up, okay, who are the people that have 5 years of experience in this area, for example. It's that scanner, they're usually pretty good, but they're more likely to miss stuff if they scan a PDF and scan it badly, because the formatting in a PDF, if you've ever tried to copy and paste from a PDF, is not always going to be consistent with the formatting on Word. And to be honest, this is a good reason to never use weird formatting, whether it's a Word doc or a PDF. So not like, text boxes or anything like that. Just try to have a very straightforward layout from a technical standpoint so that a computer can process it so that it doesn't get messed up as it's sent to your ultimate hiring manager. One other small trick that you might see with some of these applicant tracking systems, especially with larger organizations, is they might be trying to pull people from a specific area for a specific opportunity, especially if they've got like a resume pool that they're going to be looking through later, where maybe you didn't get that opportunity that you first applied for, but they've hung on to what you sent in. As you know, it's very common to say relocating to the area that you're trying to relocate to if you're trying to move, say, from where your university is out to Washington, D.C. What you might want to add is a zip code there for like the general, the center of the metropolitan area. So you might say relocating to Washington, D.C. 20010 or something along those lines. Because some of these applicant tracking systems are also going to be looking at zip codes to try to get a picture of where the applicant pool is for an opportunity in a particular location. Another thing to think about, people ask about how long their resume should be. I think if you're early in your career, for instance, if you're just starting out, unless you've got some really unusual, really diverse experience that's not typical for someone in that position, 1 page is going to be enough. Again, this is for standard resumes. Your federal resumes, your academic CVs are a totally different ballgame. Let's see if we got any questions here. I don't see any yet, so let's keep plowing ahead. Next up, I want to talk about something I call a master resume. This is one of my favorite pieces of advice that those of you who have had like a career consultation call with me, something like that, will know that I'm always talking about these. The idea is to really get everything that you've got in one place as your starting point for when you're building out your resume. So you're going to take all the experiences that you've had. You're not going to be thinking about a particular job opportunity or even necessarily a particular category of jobs, because I can tell you your career path is often not going to be very linear in the way that you might have planned it out, where 4 years in, you're going to be at this level, 10 years in, you're going to be at that level, then you get, elected to this, then to that, then you're president. And that's your typical poli-sci major career plan. Instead, you want to build something that's a lasting resource. So you're going to take every one of those experiences, look at them through as many of these different lenses that we're going to go through as you can, and really get it all out there. There's no length limit for this. Make it as long as you need to be. The first part of this is it's a great tool for retaining details from stuff that you've done that you might not remember in 5 or 6 years that might be relevant to something that you're applying to in that future time. You can also use this space to retain some anecdotes from some of these jobs, anecdotes about success, anecdotes about challenges, anecdotes about coworkers, working with different types of people, as fodder for you to jog your memory if you're preparing for an interview, because that's what people are going to want to talk about in many interviews, in a behavioral style interview. And then what you're going to do with this huge document that you've built with like 8 million bullet points is for every opportunity, you're going to save a new copy of that document. And you're going to start cutting stuff out that clearly isn't relevant. And so you're going to be paring it down so that instead of one generic resume that you send to every opportunity, you're going to have a highly tailored resume that's got the best details from across your career that's really fitted to the particular opportunity that you're targeting. And that kind of gets to the next point I wanted to bring up, which is tailoring your resume. For those of you who were at our session 2 weeks ago on a Thursday night with Kate Kaiser from Win Without War, you'll remember that she talked about how much of a difference it made in her early career job search when she started customizing her resume and her cover letter to each role that she was applying for. And it really, it was night and day for her. And I think that that's a good principle. Ideally, you want to have a unique resume tailored for each role that you're applying for. At a minimum, you should be investing more time tailoring your resume to opportunities that you're the most excited about, where you feel you're best suited, where you feel that's something you really want to land. And what you can then often do is reuse some of these resumes that you've saved that you made for roles that are similar to a job you're applying for down the line, so that you don't have to rework it from the master resume every time. But even then, I think it's worth taking a look back at that master to see if there's anything that you missed, because a lot of opportunities, even for example in the think tank space where there's a lot of very similar research jobs, they'll have some finer pointed skills on there that are going to vary a lot across organizations, in things like software, et cetera, that you might want to have the ability to pull some of that stuff in for each opportunity. You're going to be looking at the keywords that you see in the job announcement, of course, and bringing those in, particularly hard skills, things like software suites that you might need to use. And the needs of that employer, again, are going to be the framework as you're tailoring this. So you're really going to be looking at that announcement, thinking about intel that you might have gathered through your networking or through knowing the hiring manager or a colleague at this organization, to really zero in on exactly what it is that they're trying to do. The reason that's important is that you don't have a need to necessarily give each experience that you've had over the course of your career equal time, or even mention everything that you've done. You want to use the most space for the stuff that you most want to emphasize. And within this, you're going to really be using a reverse chronology that's very standard across resumes. The question that a lot of these hiring managers are going to be asking is kind of a parallel to the classic, what have you done for me lately? They want to see what you've used, what skills you've used most recently, in addition to the ones that you've used the most. And so things like your education may move off that top slot of your resume pretty quickly at the beginning of your career. And there may even be cases in which if you're just coming out of college, if you've got some good internships, it may be that your education isn't your strongest selling point for that role. I would also add that as you get further into your career, some of the older stuff, you probably don't need to include that much detail, and some of it can even disappear, especially if it's stuff like a high school job. Like, if you were considering me for a role, you probably don't need to know that I worked at Wendy's 15 years ago, because even the skills that were required in that, if I were using them again, I haven't used them in a long time, so they might be kind of dead skills. As you're tailoring, you're also going to be tailoring your cover letter. Again, you'll remember from Kate's session a couple weeks ago, some really good tips on tailoring your cover letter. But you can use a lot of things with that cover letter to balance off your resume, to re-emphasize stuff that you really wanted to highlight, and maybe throw some color into that. Maybe it's some narrative about one of your bullet points, some more detail, maybe try to get some emotional engagement or talk about your own motivations that draw you to this field. You can also use it conversely if there are some serious gaps in your resume, to talk about that, or if you're realigning your career, you can really use that in your cover letter. You can even use a cover letter to pull out something that you want to include, but that doesn't really fit in a resume. So maybe it's not related to your workplace experience, anything like that. Let's see if we got any questions here. Still none. All right. Yeah. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to ask. Or actually, okay, I got one. I've got one right here. So on a skills section. So I think from Austin. So I'm going to go into this. I think it's the next item on my agenda to talk about particular skills. This gets a little bit to a debate that's out there between chronological and functional resumes. I'm really talking about chronological resumes here, where you break it down by the jobs that you've had. But in a functional resume, you're going to be breaking it down by the skills that you use. I would say that's it's a bit of a power move, in my opinion, to use one of those functional style resumes just because it's unusual. I think you would have to do it really well. I think it's okay to include a skills section if it's not really covered in your main experience section. In particular, for stuff like foreign languages or software, if it's not directly been addressed, or if they were really clear about those skills in the job announcement. But even then, if they put a lot of emphasis on those skills, it may be worth laying that out in a clear way within the context of particular jobs. Because like I know how to use some video editing software, but I'm not very good at it because it's not actually part of my job. So like that's going to look different on my resume than someone who's a professional video editor and can say, I used Adobe Premiere Pro to do this or that. And I think I saw another question, but I'll go ahead and move on, and we can circle back at the next stopping point here. So to really zoom in on how to look at your experience and skill through some different languages. The first and most classic lens that you're going to use is your hard skills. So these tend to be described as things that you can measure. Often they're something that you can be certified in, trained in. You can easily demonstrate the skill, whether it's by taking a test or, if you're an electrician, like fixing something that's broken, or saying like, here, I know what this part is, that'll demonstrate that you have that skill. I mean, like having a law degree indicates the hard skill of being a lawyer. Some hard skills that are common within the foreign policy space would include using languages, what your language knowledge, and there's often ways to get to take testing on that if you're concerned about showing that in a really concrete way. You can also just describe your level of ability. Software, of course, is another common one. As you're writing out software, I think it can be important sometimes to categorize or otherwise add some descriptor to your skill, to the software skill that you have. So for example, I know how to use Canva. I don't know how many people know what Canva is because it's not super common. It's an in-browser photo editing, graphics creation tool. So you might consider putting that in a category, saying image editing, Canva. Similarly, if I had that skill set or maybe a slightly more advanced bit of imaging editing software that's not Photoshop, and most people when they think image editing think Photoshop, I might say Pixlr, parentheses, similar to Photoshop, so that I'm getting that keyword in there so that they know I can edit photos. And maybe I'd have a little bit of a learning curve, but if that's not the main skill they need, it's just kind of a secondary. I've put my leg up over someone who doesn't have that. And again, I've triggered that keyword in the ATS. Another skill that you'll commonly see people list is Microsoft Office Suite. Of course, if it's in the announcement, you want to list that. For most of the roles in the foreign policy space, I think it is kind of assumed that you at least know the very basics. But if you have skill that's beyond that, within some of these suites, for example, if you've been trained, if you've got some basic computer science experience, you might want to indicate that in a descriptive way within this skill section. Especially like Microsoft Excel, there's huge variability between someone who can say, I know how to make a basic spreadsheet and read it, and I know how to highlight the cells and make a chart, versus someone who knows how to use really good formulas and make arrays and use Visual Basic and use macros and some of these other kind of like power user type things, where you're going to really be able to stand out from the crowd if that's a skill that's needed. But if you just say, I know Office Suite, including Excel, that doesn't actually give them a lot because there's a lot of people that can say that. Another common hard skill, and I think it can be important to think of this as a hard skill, is social media engagement, which is a common set within the communication space that you'll see in several foreign policy field roles. That can include public diplomacy, actually just comms and outreach. Some of those are going to include stuff like social media or different data software that's designed to engage people in social digital spaces. Let's see if we got any questions. Nothing yet. The other kind of mirror image of hard skills is soft skills. And these are things that are hard to measure, quantify, hard to certify. And so a lot of people, especially early in their career, tend not to think in those terms and tend to leave it off their resume. And actually, I think for many roles, especially those involving any kind of leadership or judgment, these are some of the most important skills. They often involve social skills. They can include things like analytic thinking or your work habits, your ability to engage with others effectively. And in a lot of roles, these really are critical. And even in a hard skill centered role, you might, if you're like an engineer or something, the stereotype about engineers is that they don't have very good social skills and that this is kind of a liability for them in their work. But if you're actually pretty good at that and you can talk about, leadership roles you've held or different types of challenging conversations that you've had, and you're able to, put that in some bullet points in addition to just like, here are some different things I've accomplished. I think that can really strengthen that resume. So just to kind of run through some examples here of soft skills: being good at building relationships, knowing how to lead projects, which is also something you can get a certification in a kind of a technical way, like project management professional. There's stuff like anticipating and resolving challenges that may arise in your role, something that's really important if, for instance, you're involved in planning events. Working with minimal supervision, limited guidance is a soft skill. Developing new ideas, showing initiative, that's another soft skill. And what you're going to want to do within the context of your resume, maybe also your cover letter, if you want to emphasize your soft skills, is describe how you use those skills in a role. How working in a fairly unstructured environment, you were able to accomplish all of these tasks, even though you had a lot of different things on your plate and a lot of pressure and deadlines. Those are things that are more getting into the soft skill space, but are actually really desirable traits. And another mistake that people will make with regards to soft skills is seeing them as character traits, where it's like, I'm good with people, and that's just an immutable fact about myself, or I'm not good at this, and that's an immutable fact about myself. And actually, a lot of these things are things that can be learned or sharpened or developed, or you can be weak at it and you're still weak at it, but you're not as bad. I'm just going to send in the chat here a link to a list of 135 soft skills that is one of probably the most comprehensive list out there. A lot of them have some duplication, but they break it down into some categories. I'd really recommend, before taking a big pass at making a master resume, taking a look through this, even just skimming the headings and the graphics that they have in there. There's a lot of really good stuff in this that can help you pull some of these out. And I would also say for if you're a student or your early career, your extracurriculars and your volunteering are a great way to show and develop some of these soft skills and exhibit them without having that work experience. The next lens for looking at your past experience is your duties and your responsibilities. And what you want to do here is give a sense of the scope of what you were doing and the scale of the work that you were responsible for. And this is more of a preface to some of these accomplishments that you might want to be describing, or some more detail that you want to be filling in, because duties alone are not enough, because both really great employees in the job that you had and really mediocre employees can truthfully say that they had those same duties, the duties of their job. So for example, let's say you've got a bullet point on your resume and it says, I was responsible for safety at the world's largest indoor shark farm. I mean, that's pretty impressive right there. That's a, it's the world's largest. So you know that it's involves sharks. So safety is an important job at a shark farm. Now let's compare two different bullet points that can follow that up. One, I designed and implemented a new safety program that led to a 30% reduction in safety incidents, and there were no OSHA claims during my tenure as the safety manager at this large indoor shark farm. Compare that to someone whose next bullet point is the company went out of business after the sharks ate our main client. Obviously, you're going to have a very different response to those two people. So within the context of those duties and responsibilities, as you're talking about them, I think it's really key to start saying, what was it that enabled your success in that role? And or what did you accomplish in that role? That's where the duties and responsibilities really acquire meaning. And then to look at those accomplishments for a second, I think it's really important to make them tangible, ideally quantifiable. Concrete things like you were employee of the month, that's objective. That's something that is not just saying like, yeah, I made this better. And there can be some real challenges with this in a team context. And what I would say is you really want to try to break out your role. And I think really thinking broadly about what it is that you did that enabled the team to achieve it, that's how you want to do it. So, sometimes you're the star performer and it's pretty obvious, but sometimes you're in more of a supporting role, and it's about the virtues you exhibited that made the team successful. So maybe you showed off that you had the ability to do rapid turnaround or consistency and reliability. So yeah, you weren't the main person. You were the guy on the football team that won the Super Bowl that holds the snap for the place kicker. But the fact that they know that you can do your job reliably means that they could go ahead and call the play for that last second field goal because they know that you're going to get that ball down, laces out, and the kicker is going to be able to do his job. So that's kind of the frame that you want to bring in as you're looking at those accomplishments. And again, I would be looking from a lot of different angles at these because it might the types of accomplishments that are going to matter are going to vary a lot by the role. And again, you're going to be tailoring your resume to each role. So it's not really something that you can sit down and say, this is the only accomplishment in that role that's going to matter. Some other stuff, just miscellaneous that you might want to be pulling in within this, some of these lenses for a foreign policy resume. Overseas experience, highlighting that you worked in a different location other than the United States, maybe that you were working across cultures, that you were dealing with different kinds of people, could also be across different social strata, different settings from highly formal to highly informal. Being able to navigate that is really important in our field. Also, of course, languages skills. If you were using a language in the workplace, for many jobs, that's going to be pretty important. Whereas if you were working in an overseas environment, but you were conducting business in English, that's still really cool, but that's just one less thing that you can claim that might be a highlight for certain roles. Of course, for many roles, highlighting your research and publications is good. Ideally, they're going to let you send in a writing sample if that's relevant to the role that you're doing. But otherwise, you can include a bullet point or a category for writing. If you've written extensively, you might need to be broad and descriptive. You'll see a lot of people in their bios, like people who are senior scholars at think tanks will say, so-and-so has been widely quoted in the press and has written for, and then list off, kind of like the 5 most prestigious publications that they've appeared in, as opposed to listing every single thing that they've written, which unless you've written only 1 or 2 things and they're highly relevant to that role, you're not going to want to bullet those out. You'll also sometimes have some software knowledge that can come in a foreign policy job context. Of course, some kind of quantitative skills like statistical software for stuff like program evaluation or some of the more poli-sci oriented roles that you'll be dealing with. Let's see if we got any questions here. All right. Nothing for the moment. So let's move on to the question that I got from a few folks. How should your resume look if you don't have a lot of experience? So as I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about soft skills, you can really lean on extracurriculars, volunteering, community involvement to get some pretty decent bullet points. Because ultimately, I think you might have some accomplishments there. You might also have some character traits or virtues that you had to exhibit in order to succeed in that role. And again, just plow through that list of soft skills that I sent out, because there's a lot of good stuff in there that if, for example, you were involved in leadership in your JQA chapter on your college campus, you're probably going to realize, oh yeah, like when we did that event, I had to use like 5 of these. And when we were planning our leadership transition, I had to do these other 5 things, and I had to deal with these other kinds of people, and all of these things are often going to come in some of these settings. You can also use your academic experience rather than just having a couple of bullet points about like, here's what my GPA was, here's the name of the university and what my major was, maybe title of my senior thesis. You can dig in a bit to some of the things that you feel enabled your success, and really highlight those. I would also say this is a place to have a really good summary statement at the top of your resume, just because that gives you a chance to put some narrative into what you're trying to accomplish and what you can offer that maybe your resume doesn't have. And again, if your resume isn't your strongest suite, then yeah, you're going to want to have a really solid cover letter where you really show that the target firm that you're trying to get into, the opportunity. And I would say, not to toot the society's own horn here, but when it comes to knowing that background on an organization, getting involved with an organization like the JQA Society is a way to do that, because we're trying to connect people with a lot of the players in Washington, and also just help them be better oriented in the space. Again, if you've had a career consultation call with me, that's probably about half of what we've talked about is here are these other places where your skills might be relevant. And then let's talk about think tank resumes for just a second. So I was at the Center for the National Interest and its magazine, its publication, The National Interest, for about 5 years at the start of my career. And so I'm most familiar with the research-oriented roles, and that's what I'm going to talk about here. There are some like event planning, accounting, administration type roles that are out there where this might not be quite as relevant, and you might want to think of it more as just a traditional job in that field. But you might want to throw some bullets in, again, in that education section that are describing some research projects you've been on, some papers you've written, some courses you've taken. And if you feel like you're a little weak in that area, you can even highlight, say, outlets that you regularly turn to as you seek news and analysis that are relevant to the issue that you're going to be working on in the role that you're targeting. So like, I'm an Iran policy guy. That's my main area of expertise. So, if you look at my resume, I haven't worked on Iran policy directly in several years. So I'm probably going to add in like, yeah, I've stayed engaged in this space. Here are some writings I've done that can point to that fact. And also, like, I, listen to the BBC Persian service every day to stay current. Like, that's something that's going to be a bit of a balance for the fact that I haven't worked in that field where that's my main responsibility for several years. And if you're highlighting publications that you've done, which, if you're at the student or early career level, I would say write for your student newspaper, start a blog or a Medium. If you're dealing with an individual, even if they don't necessarily solicit a writing sample, it's okay to maybe throw one of those in, throw in a hyperlink, or a PDF of an article, and just say, hey, since I mentioned my writing and since it's really relevant to this role, here's an article that you might want to take a look at. That's especially true if, like, say you were a columnist for a student newspaper or something like that, where you've got a lot of writing out there where a lot of it might not be relevant to the role. And you want to have them look at something that most shows off not just your skills, but your relevant knowledge. And you'll remember from several of the last of these sessions that we had people saying, hey, writing is a really important skill across the several different domains we've covered, think tanks, intelligence, foreign policy advocacy, et cetera. So I wanted to, let's see if we got any questions. All right, we got two. All right, so Zachary, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, if you've got your camera, feel free to turn it on, or just type it in, and I can go ahead and answer that question first.
Yeah, so I was wondering what hard skills we could potentially develop, given that over the next few weeks or months, we all might be stuck inside and not really able to do normal internships that we plan to.
Yeah. Well, I would say, at least in the foreign policy space, a lot of internships don't really develop hard skills, although they might give you a chance to use them. I would say this might be a good time to learn some software that's either generally useful or specialized to the role that you're in. I would say data science, Microsoft Excel, those are skills that can often really make people stand out. You can plug into, especially with some of this more software oriented stuff. There's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of online courses, Coursera, edX, some certification programs for things like programming languages where you can get a digital certificate that you have developed skill in this particular area. So I'd say that's probably where you want to focus, as opposed to some of the other stuff that's a little bit harder to get concrete. You can always get even more deep on whatever issue area you're working on, though. That's another direction you could go. Nicholas, we've got a great link in here for another data science learning site from Jacob. Thank you. Nicholas from Colorado College. Oh, wait, he typed it in. So if you held multiple roles at the same time that are both relevant experience, do you think it's worth listing both of them? Or will it look as though you're less committed to each role? I think especially early career, it's fine to have stuff that's cross-listed. And you'll also notice that a lot of the most senior people in say the think tank field are going to be cross-listed. And that's actually a selling point, that they're a fellow at this and a non-resident fellow at that. I hope that answers your question. Christopher.
This Christopher?
Yes. Sorry, the one with your hand up.
Okay, thank you. So my question is related to if your background is less directly related to, so for point of reference, if your educational background is in the foreign policy world, but your current career background is not, what sort of skills and how should my career resume be retailored in order to make me more competitive? And is there anything I can do during the quarantine time to foster more skills for foreign policy work?
Yeah, so I would say, you want to show that you've continued to be engaged in the foreign policy space, that you're staying current on what's going on. If you want to keep your name out there, this could be a great time to write a piece, although, I don't know how much I'd recommend writing on the virus itself, just because every publication is swamped with virus articles. And, unless you're an epidemiologist, it's going to be hard to break through that noise. But I think, working on your writing skills, and then beyond that, it's really going to depend on the opportunity, but be thinking through some of those different lenses that I was talking about. I think in particular, the soft skills, because you will have been building those up in pretty much any role. And getting some really good examples of those, maybe building out some specific stories of situations you dealt with some of these different skills, because those are still going to be relevant to any role, regardless of what the content of it is. So, and I think, between that and your cover letter, using it to tell a story, I think that might be the way to set yourself up for the most success here. Zach Libo, got your hand up.
Yeah. Hey, John. Thanks so much for doing this. I have two questions. One, actually, let's just start off with the last thing you just said, right? Maybe we can use this time to get our work published. Are there any recommended outlets that you think would be good for this? That we should be workshopping for? And that's my first question. And then my second one is any templates, resume templates that you really like that you can point us to that are ATS friendly and all that stuff. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
To be honest, on the template side, you might even just Google that. I I've got a couple resumes I'm going to show here that look pretty good. And like, I can tell you my old resume used to be very non-ATS friendly because I used a template that said like, you're going to put your name up at the top and it's going to automatically put like 2 spaces between each letter. So it spreads out and looks really dramatic. I could see that really screwing up with how a computer reads something. On the publication side, one thing that the society supports is a publication called the Realist Review. It's run by students, and it's focused on foreign policy. They're always looking for new content, so that's a great way to. It's intended to be a developmental space for people who haven't done a lot of publishing before, so that you can work on that skill. They've got people who are going to help you edit. And then it also means that, if someone Googles your name, it's got, policy relevant writing for you that's out there instead of like, for a lot of people, it'll be like, oh, here's my high school track scores or something like that. So does that answer your 2 questions?
Yeah, it does. And I also see that Byron Stokes sent some templates.
Thank you.
Yes, but I actually recently graduated with my master's in foreign policy. So would the Realist Review still apply to me or no?
Yeah, I mean, anybody can submit to it. I've been thinking of putting some pieces of my own up there to kind of support the outlet because it's that would be a good start. I mean, and I think as this dies down, like you can use this time to write a piece that's going to be relevant in the future, like something that's kind of timeless, maybe some long-term strategic trend or some chronic issue that's out there where it's not necessarily going to be something that has to run like this week. You can definitely try to get published on the virus, but I would try smaller outlets and to be really specific and using like some special expertise that you have. So like, for instance, if you know a particular country really well, being able to talk about it in the context of that situation. And maybe, if you're talking about U.S. foreign policy, how this is going to impact the U.S. relationship with that country going forward. That might be a viable lens. But again, like the space is just swamped. And I mean, I know a lot of people who are engaged on either the publishing or getting published side of this. And it's really tough right now to get out there. So I would just wait until the Zoom or the rush of articles about the virus starts to slow down, which I think is even going to happen once the virus is kind of on the downslope, which hopefully will be soon. Let me see. I think I had one question right here. All right, Katie. So she's asking, she's interning for a small foreign policy nonprofit related to women's issues. When she glanced at summer internship applications, a lot of the applicants have similarly good applications, relevant experience, good formatting, internationally focused clubs. How would you stand out when the pool is quite homogenous? I think one, awesome cover letter. Clearly showing that you really know that role. And if you don't have a cover letter, you really are leaning on your resume. I think really that fine-tuned tailoring where you've looked at through a lot of those different lenses and been really aggressive about cutting out stuff that's not like exactly relevant, where if you can't say, this is how this moves me forward for this exact job, it's not on the page. I think that might give you an edge. Also, that kind of summary statement at the top. But I really think the cover letter, maybe trying to use something that's a memorable anecdote, again, like engaging the emotions. A lot of people approach this in a very rationalistic way, but saying like, the reason I'm interested in working in, in your case, an institute that works for women's issues is, I've seen a lot of security-focused foreign policy organizations in Washington that are very male-heavy, and I know a lot of people have been the only woman in the room, and being able to say like, hey, I don't want to have that be what the next generation is experiencing, because I was in this meeting one time where I experienced this, and it really changed how I look at things. Being able to engage somebody with their feelings and not just their head, I think that's where you're going to stand out. Zach, did you have a follow-up quick question? Because I wanted to show some examples here.
Just real quick. I was wondering if you know of any digital internships opportunities this summer that might be able to either transition from being in person to online, or just maybe that we're already online that we could look at.
Yeah, so I'm going to be keeping an eye out for this in our newsletter. I make sure everybody who registers with their email for this, it will get an initial subscription to our newsletter. You're free to unsubscribe if you don't want it. But every week, typically on a Friday, we'll send out a handpicked list. I've seen a couple of roles that are already remote. I'm hoping that some of the, for instance, some of the think tanks are going to start thinking about this in a more robust way, because right now you're probably not going into the office, and so you might as well be doing that job from anywhere. And there's a lot of people for whom remote it really opens up a lot of opportunities. DC is an expensive place to live. I mean, it's one of the many reasons that there's an access issue in the foreign policy space. So I'd say I'm keeping an eye out for it. I'm going to try to highlight it in our newsletter. And I would also encourage reaching out to some of these organizations, especially the smaller ones, and saying, hey, I can do this for you remotely, and maybe even proposing like a specific project or something to say, like a think tank scholar. I think that might be a way where if you're making it easy for them to say yes, they might be willing to work with you.
Awesome, thank you.
I realize, so, Samir, I'm sorry I missed your question there. Let me scroll up. Let's see. How many pages? Yeah, in Europe, I know Europe has the thing with the photo, which I find just shocking, because that's not remotely relevant to your ability to do a job. But in an American resume, no photo. I would definitely say 1 page if you're early career, 2 pages if you're later in your career and you have a lot of stuff that's clearly relevant to the role. We've got about 10 minutes left officially. I wanted to get to some examples here. I might keep working through them. I want to be respectful of folks' time. So I will just again, so you're aware, if you scroll up to the top of the chat, if you've got to sign off in the next 10 minutes or so, because I want to keep talking and answering folks' questions here. If you have to sign off in the next 10 minutes or so, scroll up to the top of the chat. Our next session next week with Ben Dennison on regime change. He's a scholar out of Tufts. It's going to be at 6 p.m. We moved it from 7 for those of you who are already registered, because Passover is at like 7:25 or something, depending on where you are. So let me go into screen share right here, and I'll pop back a few times to see folks that might have questions. I want to pull up some of the resumes that I had that folks had sent in. I've anonymized these a bit. But let me show, this one is from Mason. I was really excited to get to use this redacted feature here, just because made me feel cool. But let me just show some of the stuff here that I wanted to pull out. First off, no statement of purpose here. He's got a pretty diverse set of work experiences, which I think it is good to be able to highlight. And so I think really pulling on that with a purpose statement that can highlight what's relevant for the particular role is going to be key, because he's done a lot of different stuff here. Next up, in this experience section, he's describing his current role at Google. The first 2 items, monitor a variety of sources to detect and escalate developing issues worldwide, and then research and report abuse through relevant channels. Those are responsibilities. So really being able to articulate, for instance, if you're monitoring stuff, you're probably using judgment. And so you need to be able to follow certain policies, maybe exercise some independent judgment, like, hey, yeah, we don't have a rule against this, but we might want to start paying attention to this particular phenomenon. Those are some things that might come out in this. So again, I think, looking at those lists of soft skills is a really great way to go beyond the responsibilities. A really strong point I thought here was he lists that he contributed to a research brief on the coronavirus situation. If you're reading this resume like tomorrow, I think that this is going to really stick out for you. You might ask a question. This is what everybody's talking about. It also shows, I think, a soft skill of probably responding to something that's fast moving that you didn't necessarily have skill in going into, so this new business situation, it's dealing with change, which is actually really important in a lot of roles. And so I would also say contributed is kind of vague. This is an example of something where you might want to articulate exactly what your contribution was. Even if it's a support role, being able to tell that story can be pretty compelling. Let me just scroll down here. He's got up here some overseas experience. He had some up at the top. He has some down here that he taught English in Hungary, that he studied in Hungary, that he studied in Thailand. For some internationally focused roles, I think this is really something that you might even want to highlight as an independent section or really draw on in your cover letter. I think it's good that he's got it listed out here as kind of an independent section, or as something that's listed right here instead of in the description. And then he talks about dealing with new cultures. Something to highlight right here with this next role. It says he drafted the CEO speech for the 2018 Lewis Houghton Awards. Now, awards. I will say I don't know what the Lewis Houghton Awards are. Maybe I'm particularly ignorant. Like that might be something that I should know, but I don't. It's possible that other hiring managers, including ones that maybe work in HR and don't necessarily know the finer points of the field, might also not know what this is. So I would just explain that. This is presumably, given that it's the CEO's speech, this is something that's probably going to be seen by a lot of people. So there's some responsibility there. It's a very high-profile occasion for this organization, I would imagine. So it's just something that you can probably lay out, and it's actually going to tell a more compelling story because you can say, I was involved in this thing that was really important to this group, even though I was just an intern. Like, I think that's a pretty cool story right there. Last thing I wanted to highlight right here, I don't know if this is a typo. It could be, the Capitol distinction, the Capitol being the building and kind of the institution of like a legislature, the Capitol being with an A being the city. So depending on how that's what that's describing, which I'm not entirely sure, I think it might be the OL version. So it's always important to just take a second scan at this. Next up, we've got Dan's resume. I think I saw Dan on earlier, so hopefully this will be useful. Just a few things to highlight up here. He's got a relevant coursework section listed under his education. Also, really great GPA. I think it's smart to list that first if you've got a GPA that good. The relevant coursework section is great to include, especially if some of these are relevant to the role that you're describing. So you may cut some of these out depending on what you're working on. So like if it's a Middle East policy role, you probably could save space by cutting out the fact that you worked on Southeast Asia. But I think this is a great thing to be thinking about, especially when you're earlier in your career. Next up, he talks about a couple of roles that he had with an event services organization. And there's some really great description of some of the stuff that he was doing. But I think getting some quantifiable stuff in here to give a sense of what the scale of this role is. And also to dig out some of the soft skills. I said there's probably some involved in enforcing safety and behavior policies, dealing with challenging situations. It's not always easy to go up to people who are acting up and deal with that in a way that's constructive and actually gets them to change their behavior. I think there's probably a lot of really good soft skill stuff in here, like daily documentation, that if those are important records, that diligence can actually really matter. But really getting some quantification here, because I'm guessing, knowing the kind of California student activity scene, that this was actually a pretty serious job. And I think that would come out a little more. Down here, we've got the first four of these in his description of his Model United Nations role is pretty much all responsibilities. We get a little bit of a sense of like, okay, this was a really well-ranked team. So there's some prestige coming in here. We get that there was some experience with training, and we get that it ultimately seems to have resulted in some of these outcomes here. This is where you hit pay dirt, and I think maybe articulating a little better either here, if it's important to the role that he's applying for with this particular resume, articulating that how these responsibilities turned into that outcome. I think that could be really helpful. And then over here, again, we have a description of an activity that doesn't really indicate the results. And that's something that you just want to be able to tell a little bit more of a story of. I mean, I think this is still something that for many roles, if it's like a marketing role, you're probably going to get a question about this bullet point, but you'd get a better question and stand out more for a role like that if you've articulated a bit more here. But again, it's hard to say objectively like that this is the right amount or too little description of this. Because again, every resume needs to be tailored to the role. So this might actually be something where you could just tinker with the wording of this and get a little more results in there rather than having like 3 bullet points on it. Next, let's pivot to Fernando's resume. I would note this is a 2-page resume, but I think it's okay because there's extensive experience here. I really like this opening statement, driven operations manager, experience in logistical communication, manufacturing operations, responsible for employees, production efficiencies, and ensuring daily tasks run smoothly, quickly, efficiently, and safely. Experience working in combat zones and industrial environments. And that tells a really good story about who you're going to get. That he then articulates as you go down. And also like you're probably, it's going to pique your interest when you see combat zones and industrial environments, that this is not necessarily someone off the street who has very basic experience, but this is someone who's experienced some of these issues in different settings. One thing to highlight, I really like this strength section up here. I would say the public speaking, I didn't really see anything directly in the rest of the resume that articulates that. And so there could be cause to explain, for instance, I think there were a lot of things here that would have required leadership skills further down here, where it at least is going to provide a little context to that. You're going to presume like, okay, this would have involved public speaking. But that's just something I wanted to highlight, that it's you don't have to always have a strength be supported, but if it's a key strength, you would expect to see it down here, I think. There's some great quantitative stuff up here in this description of his current role as a plant operations manager, describing, maintained year-to-date cost per case at 98.1% of planned budget, resulting in savings of more than $100,000. That's pretty awesome. If you're in a business role, saving $100,000 is great. The only qualitative thing I could find is saying that there was strict adherence to some quality assurance processes that got this really low customer complaint level. And I think it's a really great description of the quantitative, because it's saying not just it was the 9.8% complaint level, but it was 9.8% below the planned level. So you're saying you've beat some targets, which is awesome. It's giving some sense to that for people who don't necessarily know this role. But the strict adherence says to me that there's a lot of virtues that are required to do all of this. And maybe being able to just say, even with the few words, like, why was it that you achieved these really good efficiency ratings, really good savings? It was diligence. It was, working closely with a team and communicating the importance of some of these priorities across a number of different employees. Like that, I think, is where you're going to get some of that might help tell that story a bit better. This is a bit of a formatting note. All of the following elements, as far as I can tell, are under the heading of the naval experience. And I like that it's set off a little bit here by putting the time over here, whereas everywhere else it's right up against this. But there might be a way to like put in a little line, maybe do a little bit of basic formatting that's going to highlight, or maybe some indent. I mean, you don't want to get too fancy, but everything here is subordinate to this heading. And you get that if you read it and a military experience, like that these things are related to the naval role. But that's just something that you might want to highlight. A few little bullet points here. So he says in this current role, he revitalized the newsletter program in order to increase internal communications throughout the region. I would really like some description here of the value that created for the organization. Like, what did the organization get out of having done this? So, for example, even just increasing internal communications. I mean, were you flooding people's inboxes, or were you helping achieve coordination across a lot of functions? And you're able to say, like, this was highly read. My higher ups were getting feedback based on stuff that they saw in the newsletter. People repeatedly were saying how grateful they were for this program because it helped them stay on track with what everybody else was doing. I think being able to lay that out a little better, especially if you see this as an important point for the role that you're applying for, I think that could be really helpful. Because again, revitalizing it, it implies there's some initiative here, but it doesn't necessarily say what the value created was, because not all initiative is valuable. Scrolling down a bit here, there's a big contract renewal under here, $2.6 million contract. It involved organizing it. You see a lot of other dealing with change in this function. And I think, maybe articulating that a bit, whether here or in a cover letter, could really make this stand out even more. Another soft skill thing I wanted to highlight down here is serving in a role on short notice. Maybe it wasn't a big deal. So you'll know more your experience how relevant this is. But being able to step up in a setting might require some preparedness that you weren't necessarily expected to have in your current role. So that it says you were going above and beyond. And so I think laying that out a little bit more clearly could be good. One thing up here on this point about working to manage manpower requirements and travel logistics for operations around the Pacific and Bold Alligator in 2012, and then adding 2 of the Navy's largest multinational exercises that highlight sea power among the U.S. and its allies. That's really great context. If you're in any kind of role where people who are outside that field aren't necessarily going to know, or people who are outside your organization aren't going to know the significance of, RIMPAC, I think it's really great to be articulating that in a way that a lay person can understand. I think this is especially something that people who, like Fernando, are veterans will deal with. Because there's a lot of skills that folks in the military use that may seem not directly related to things in the corporate world, but actually the soft skill components of that are extremely valuable. So highlighting that, being able to explain it to a civilian like me is really helpful. Next up, again, there's probably some really good soft skills in this section here, where he's talking about having worked with a large 110-member team with a combined force that represented 29 nations and 3 task forces. So you're talking about dealing across cultures and across organizations. Later on, he talks about flawless execution of some change of command ceremonies and some high-level visits, including display of diplomatic protocol, which in some roles you might want to really highlight that. But either way, event planning, being diligent, these are examples of soft skills that are really awesome to have. Another thing up in this next section here talks about managing almost 400 personnel, conducting U.S. Customs inspections on service members, et cetera, across the Middle East. Given that you're dealing with a large team, there's probably some great examples here for leadership skills, including for dealing with a team that is way bigger than people that because it's pretty easy to supervise a small team of people because you're able to interact with everybody regularly. You can really be checking in and offering really personalized guidance. Whereas when you're in this large setting, you really need to be setting the tone. And so that's a kind of skill that's qualitatively different from smaller organization types of leadership. So I think there might be some ways to explain that. Down here, I think there might be a little bit of unnecessary context, talking about some great quantitative figures around. Hey, I updated these policies that affected a large area. Covered over 110,000 personnel. And this thing that I did helped ensure the on-time return of over 110,000 personnel during a 5-month span. So that's a really great description of breaking out your role in a support role in the context of a team. That's exactly how you want to do it. Because this thing, getting 110,000 people home was not mostly just one person's effort, but this is what your role was within it, that it was providing this support. That said, it says at the end of this, meeting President Obama's deadline for responsible drawdown from Iraq. I think that that's a little bit too much context. I think that you could probably just say, meeting a presidential deadline. I think that that conveys the importance without necessarily overburdening it. I mean, you're on one line here, so you're not adding extra inches that you could use for something else. But it just struck me as a detail that might not need to be included. Again, some really great stuff here around doing stuff on short notice within 3 hours in the middle of 9/11, which is a really chaotic day where a lot of people were just like glued to their TVs saying, "Hey, I stood up and took action when there was this crisis and solved the problem on extremely short turnaround." I think that that's something that where there's a lot of potential value there that you could lay out a bit more. Especially for roles where that kind of skill is going to be valuable. Similarly, we've got some really complicated logistical stuff here, doing a food replenishment plan for a 7-month overseas deployment for a ship, ensuring all orders were accurate and timely across several international port locations, as well as replenishments at sea. That's definitely going to require working with a whole bunch of different people. It might require some cross-cultural stuff, which can be key to highlight for a lot of different international roles. Down here, we've got a description of a role as having included 1 year of project experience. I'm guessing this is for a specific role, talking about project management experience or like trying to trigger a keyword, because otherwise, I think a lot of this other detail is better. One other little detail here. The education is listed last. I think that that's right because the resume up above is really strong. But I think for some roles, having an MBA could be pretty relevant and could deserve to be mentioned more prominently. Also, if this is fairly recent, I think it could be good to list the date of that, just because it says I'm really current on these skills. If it's not recent, it might be good to just kind of leave the dates off as it is. All right, let's see if we got any questions. Let's pop back into the meeting. Let me pivot back over. Here we go. All right, so any questions that anybody had? I know we still got some folks on the line. Okay, folks asking about accessing the recording. So it should be on Facebook. If you're watching this on Facebook, you already know the answer to that. If not, I'm recording it on Zoom. I'm planning on putting it on on the Society's YouTube channel, ideally with a lot of this other context that we've developed. Any other questions from folks here? All right. Oh, Byron, did you have one?
Yeah, sorry about that, John. I actually do have a question.
Excellent.
Could you talk about the importance of data visualization? Like you touched on it earlier, about self skills and things like that. Could you kind of talk about that a little bit more? Because I'm seeing that come up, more and more about having data visualization skills, and it's pretty important.
Yeah. I mean, I think that could be a good skill to be using this time to develop. For a lot of different roles, if you're, for instance, looking to go into journalism, that's a really common skill where and programming, being able to like pull data out and then turn it into something visual or tell a story using it. Data journalism. I mean, that was really hot a few years ago. You still see a whole lot of it. I mean, there's been a lot of it with the virus, for example. Where some of the skills that support that, some of the basic programming skills, for example, or I think R is the statistical language you'd probably be using for a lot of this. That can be a really valuable asset. Does that kind of answer your question? I think it always depends on the role is my answer for most of this. But does that cover what you're getting at?
Yeah, no, definitely. I saw that R was kind of being highlighted by some actually fellowship programs. And also I saw that Python, which is a scripting language that can be used for data visualization too, was being hit on too. So I was glad that you talked about Excel because that's definitely something that like all of us can learn and maybe do a little better in, during this downtime.
Yeah, no, I think that especially stuff that can be certified like that, that
Yeah.
really tells a story. And for folks that are having resume gaps right now, I mean, you've got a great excuse. Like I wouldn't sweat having a resume gap right now too much in terms of the narrative arc of your resume. But like this would be a good way to show like, here's how I made use of that time. And I think again, like this is stuff that you can get certifications in. There's a lot of online courses out there. There's stuff that where you can audit an online course where you might not be paying. So there's a lot of great resources out there. I would also say there's a lot of stuff on YouTube. You're not necessarily going to get certification out of that, but there's a lot of really basic how-tos. And with Excel, a lot of specialized websites that'll tell you how to use certain formulas and give you even worksheets that you can work through. Any other questions? All right. So just some quick housekeeping here at the end. We've run through some basic formatting and submission tips. We've talked about how to create a master resume that can serve as the backbone of your job search, how to tailor your resume, so important to every opportunity, and also to make sure it pairs well with your cover letter, like, some fine wine and a good steak, and that you're using some different lenses to capture that past experience, hard skills, soft skills, accomplishments, responsibilities, etc. We talked a little bit about resumes for folks who don't have a lot of experience, for resumes for the think tank space. We're going to be next Wednesday, the 8th of April, 2020. We will be hosting a conversation on regime change with Ben Dennison. Let me grab that link again to send out, and I'll also send it in the follow-up email on this. And then I'm also going to be sending out a quick survey to basically get folks' opinions on what they would like topics they would like to cover in future sessions, because I think we're going to be dealing with this virus situation for a long time, and also we've been getting pretty good attendance with this, so I want to keep it up. So I'd love to hear your ideas for what you'd like to hear about in the future. We had one quick question come in while I was saying that. Juliet was asking the cover letter session from a few weeks ago. We didn't record that one. It was actually, it was just a detail mentioned about the importance of customizing cover letters, really using the job description and looking into the organization, maybe talking about the individuals that you'd be working with, and for instance, in the context of like supporting a think tank scholar or something like that, and about their work, really being able to show your individual connection to that. That's really where it comes out. That was, I would say that's the summary of it. And maybe we'll have a future session in a few weeks on how to do cover letters. But again, if you're interested in that, definitely when I send out the survey, let us know, because I want to try to meet demand here. But thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in this afternoon. I hope it was useful. Stay healthy and have a great day.